Today's scripture is from Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert.
Good morning. Good morning. So one of the pieces of this stewardship season is an opportunity to talk about why we give. And part of the reason that I asked Pastor Heather to come preach today was because I was looking forward to the opportunity to telling you why I give to the church. Now, one of the reasons is a very practical one. It's called the halo effect, which comes from a study done out of Canada from 2015 to 2016. They looked at churches and mosques and synagogues, and they looked to see what kind of impact those communities of faith had on the general community around them. And it turns out it's significant, extremely significant, to the point where for every dollar that is given to the church, about $4.71 of impact happens to the community. It's an incredible ability, partially because of what happens at the church is that people are able to be connected to each other. And that loneliness is one of the biggest challenges in society and cause a lot of problems both physiologically, mentally, spiritually. So being able to connect into a church provides this huge resource. But it's also a place of mobilization, a place where people are able to organize and be able to respond to immediate crisis and needs in the community. And it's also a place where it's a place where people are able to meet together, to be able to come in and know one another, know their communities, know their neighborhoods. It's buildings that sometimes host things, but it's also a place where people can come together where they don't have to pay and where they can connect genuinely as who they are. So that's why I give to the church. But part of the reason why I want to talk today is I want to talk about why I tithe. Now, tithing is a significant gift, and when you talk about it in terms of stewardship, it's a gift that needs to hurt a little. It's a little bit of a gift that makes you pause and go, okay, I'm actually going to choose to do this. And the reason that I tithe is because of someone that I met at Olympia. We'll call her Cheryl, and she is a regular attendee. She comes every single Sunday to church. And she will bring between 4 to 11 grandchildren with her every single Sunday. She has seatbelts for 6 people in her car. I still don't quite know how it happens. I think it's a little bit loaves and fishes. But she brings all of those grandkids, and those grandkids are the reason Olympia still has a children's program. Because there was a time when no other kids other than her grandkids came. And then when new children showed up, they were the most welcoming, inviting, loving kids that would just absorb anyone into their community, so that program was able to grow. She was able to share that. Now, Cheryl lives in the kind of poverty that you can't save your way out of. She lives in an apartment that's 800 square feet with her and the 3 grandchildren she has custody of. It's the lowest rent in the region, but it also is an apartment without any insulation. So when winter comes, there is no way to heat this apartment, so her heating bills go through the roof, and she always goes into debt every winter because she can't pay the heating bill. Right? It's those sorts of systematic poverty traps that she lives in every single day. And when it comes time for something like Thanksgiving, she will host a Thanksgiving for 70 people. She manages to find a way to feed every single person who might need it because her neighborhood is one of the roughest neighborhoods in Western Washington, and everyone there knows that her house is a safe place and a place that they can go. And then her family had a crisis. Her son got evicted from his home, and she decided that instead of having her son and her grandchildren living in the canopy bed of their truck, that she would put them up in her garage. So that meant that there was now 10 people living in her 800 square foot apartment with 1 bathroom. And she did that as a choice because she couldn't bear to see her family be homeless. So she risked eviction and homelessness herself to put this person up. She came to me with tears in her eyes, and she said, I don't know what more I can give. And I said, you know when I preach about generosity and community and doing on Sunday morning? She said, yeah. I said, you need to stop it. You've heard that message. Now please listen to the messages about Sabbath and loving yourself. But she would never stop taking care of people, and she said, Pastor Ruth, where is the church in this? Where is the church helping my family? Where is the church helping the people in my neighborhood? Are you doing something? And I said, I am doing the best I can. And the reason why I tithe, the reason why I choose to give to the point where it hurts, is so that I can look at this woman in the eye who gives more than I could ever imagine out of her poverty, than I can out of my comfort, and say, I am doing the best that I can. So by tithing, I've not paid off my student loans yet. I could have already. By tithing, I've not saved up necessarily for retirement, like every single financial planner does. They send quarterly reports to pastors and say, if you gave this much every month, you'd be able to retire by the time you're 70. And by choosing to tithe, I know I'm not on target for my 70-year-old retirement. But because of people like her, and because there are people in this community that have such deep need, and knowing what kinds of impacts church have, I make that choice to give beyond what capitalism says is wise, and to be able to change, to engage and love as best as I possibly can. So when we think about how we're giving and why we're giving, I hope that you bear in mind that when you give to this church, it is a gift not just to this local community of the people and the faces you see here, but that it has impacts beyond what we know and understand. And that churches are the best and most important tool for transformation of the society that we have. So when you give, know that your giving helps transform the world around you, and that be inspired by people like Cheryl, and be inspired by people who give so much, and I hope that you join in them in that generosity. Amen.
Amen.
All right, and now it's time for the children's moment. So, if there are any people who are kids or teenagers or who are young at heart who want to come join me up on the steps, we're going to talk about doing something new. Yes? No? Maybe? Okay, I'll just come here and talk about this. So, this was one of my favorite things that we did in kindergarten. Do you remember the bean experiment? Where you got a bean wet and you put it on a wet paper towel and then you put it in a petri dish and you watched it grow? So when I think about this Bible verse where it says, behold, I am making all things new, what we usually see is the little sprouts that come up top, right? Like we think about the plant that has propelled itself out of the ground and is showing off its leaves. But I like to think about how God prepares us for the new things. That when we plant the seed, there's a whole bunch that is going on that we don't see, that aren't necessarily aware of, that this is what is going to be able to cause the newness. There is a type of bamboo that grows 18 inches a day, but it doesn't start growing above the ground until after it's been in the ground for 18 months. So in order for it to grow 18 inches in one day, it needs to prepare its roots and soil and itself deep underground in order for it to do that new thing quickly. And so I think a lot about how God prepares us for something new is not that we can see these new things and the flowers and the fruits and be like, there's the new thing. That what we can anticipate when we're talking about the new is that recognizing that God is preparing and digging underground. So next time you see leaves or you see a tree, go, God is doing something new before we even realize it. Amen?
Amen.
Amen.
Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a delight to be with you this Sunday. As Pastor Ruth and I have talked about her new appointment here, and she's told me a little bit about the journey you're on. Whenever we talk, I feel like she's describing some of the journey that new church starts go through. I started the church I'm serving a year and a half ago-ish. We've been in multiple different building locations. But sometimes we're wondering, where are we going to be worshiping next month? We've worshiped in my house, which I have found that new people aren't that excited to go into the house of a stranger, so that's something I've learned. And so because that was a dynamic, we had to keep searching for more space. And every time we look for space, part of the work that we have to do is to ask ourselves, who are we, and who are we becoming, and who are we going to welcome in this new space? And so while it can sometimes be a frustrating journey, I really wish I knew where we were going to be in January. On the other hand, I think it keeps us always asking the questions that we need to be asking in order to bring the good news into the world. So I'm so excited to come preach in the church building. I haven't done this in a while. This is exciting for me, and to be with you here this morning. Our scripture from Isaiah talks about God doing a new thing. And ask the questions, do you not perceive it? I think that in our culture as Americans, one of the things that we wrestle with all the time is our sense of purpose. What are we supposed to be doing? Who are we? Are we using our gifts and our talents in the world in meaningful and purposeful ways? And one of the ways this question often plays out in our life is in terms of our own vocation. Think about the last time you met somebody new. What was one of the first questions that came up in conversation? What's our question? Our cultural question.
What do you mean?
What do you do? I think that it's so much a part of our culture that we don't even examine it and ask ourselves, do other cultures ask the same question? I had a friend who lived in India for 2 years. And the part of India that she lived in, the question you would always ask people had nothing to do with their vocation. It was actually the question, when did you eat last? It was a question of hospitality. How can I serve you? If you haven't eaten in a while, let me provide food for you. I actually think that's kind of a Methodist question too. When's the last time you've eaten? Let's throw a potluck. But that's another story, right? Methodists and our potlucks. So we tend to ask this question, what do you do? And I think we often tend to think of purpose in terms of individuality. What am I called to? What am I supposed to be doing in the world? What vocation will use my gifts and graces? But when the prophet Isaiah speaks those words, using the voice of God, I'm doing a new thing, now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? Isaiah's not talking to individuals, Isaiah's talking to a community. This is a call to a community to be listening for the voice of God and what God is already doing, to perceive it, and then to join in that work. And I think one of the most exciting and fruitful journeys that a congregation can go on is this journey of asking that question, what is God doing now in our midst? What new thing is springing forth? Can we perceive it? Notice that the instructions Isaiah gives to the people isn't go out and do your own new thing. Right? I think that's also a very American cultural idea, is that we should be the ones going out there and doing the new thing. But Isaiah speaks to this community and says, God is doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? It sort of flips the question on its head of purpose when we look at it from the lens of a community instead of just us as individuals, and when we begin to say this isn't our work, it's God's work amongst us, and we get to join in it. This is good work, my friends, to begin to perceive what God is doing and then to join in it. So as a church planter, I spend a lot of time doing this. I don't actually have an office. It's in my house. So that means that when there's a stack of dishes in my sink and the vacuuming needs to be done, I want to get out of my office so that the dishes aren't calling to me and nagging at me. And I go out in the community, and the community becomes my office. And I have conversations with my neighbors. And we talk, and I try to learn about them. And I try to listen for the ways in which God is already working in their lives, even if they cannot name it as God being present with them. And what I have uncovered in my work, in my community, is a deep, deep sense of loneliness. Sometimes I think that we, with our social media, we think we're really well connected, right? We have lots of friends on Facebook or people who follow us and we follow on Instagram. I'll start to give my age away when I don't name all the other social medias that my kids know about that I don't. My kids tell me Facebook is for old people, and I say that's okay. I'm fine with that. I'll claim that title. Right, so we have this sense of being deeply connected to one another, but one of the things I've uncovered is that that's often not true. That we have almost a deceptive sense of connection, which is maybe more insidious because it tricks us into thinking we do have connections. And then as I'll talk to people, what I uncover is this deep loneliness. This deep want and longing for authentic relationships where we can be who we are and be known to each other. Where we can be around people who are not necessarily like us and we can learn from them and they can learn from us. I uncover this time and time again. The other thing I uncover, and this is an interesting dynamic about church, and I've been uncovering this in the west side of Olympia in a relatively suburban, rural, upper middle class community. So this may not be true for your community. I can't speak to what your community would reveal to you if you were having these conversations, and you probably are. But the other thing I've discovered in my community is that people find out I'm a pastor, and they either say something to me like this, like, oh, I don't need church. Right? You ever hear that? I don't need church. Or people haven't even thought about whether they need church because they're not thinking about church. I don't need church. I thought I'd raise my kids in the church, but I've discovered we don't really need it. It's, we're not doing that and we're okay. Here's my favorite one. I listen to podcasts of church. I hear this all the time. I listen to podcasts of church. What that really means is they're listening to a sermon on a podcast, and I'm sure it's a better sermon than I could preach. I have no doubt about that. But when was the last time you had a great conversation, a great dialogue with a podcast? Podcasts have their place. I love them. They fill my time in the car. But podcasts aren't relationships. So we'll have this conversation about all the reasons they don't need church. And then we'll keep talking. I'm like, okay, great. What podcast do you listen to? Maybe I should be listening to it. And we'll talk for a while longer, and then there's this, or we'll have relationship built over time. And then there's what I call the crack open moment, where they will know me well enough to start to tell me what's really going on with them. People will tell me about grief that has been unhealed for 15 years in their life. People will tell me about a child so anxious that they throw up every day before they go to school. People will tell me about a sense of desperate loneliness. That when they were suffering through cancer, there was nobody by their bedside to hold their hand. If I was feeling snarky, I would say, wow, how'd that podcast help you with that? But that would not be very pastoral, would it? That's not what I say. And really, that's not even what I think, because my heart breaks. My heart breaks. That we have a culture where we have lots of forms of connection, but no true, deep, intimate relationship. Because the truth is, social media doesn't hold your hand when you're going through cancer treatments. Podcasts may talk about grief, but they can't speak actually into a healing place of your grief and be with you while you sob for that person that you lost 15 years ago. And social media has never once been a mom rubbing a daughter's back while she throws up from anxiety and has to go to school the next day. But church community can do all of those things, right? In a church community. I actually had this happen to me the other day. I was speaking at the Shelton United Methodist Church where I used to serve. I was speaking to their UMW. And a woman got up and left the sanctuary. I didn't mean to tell this story, but here it is, so I'm going to tell it. She got up and left while I was speaking. I thought she actually went to get lunch ready, because UMWs offer fabulous hospitality. And when I was done speaking, one of the women said, will you come to the restroom with me? because she has not come back. And I was like, oh, I thought she was in the kitchen. And she said, no, I think, I didn't think of a name for her off the top of my head. I don't know, Jane. I think Jane is still in the restroom. And so we went in the restroom, and Jane was in there sobbing, full body sobs. You know the kind of crying I'm talking about. And so we knocked on the stall door and invited Jane to come out, and she fell into my arms. And I call it in my household ugly crying, because I don't look so attractive when I do that kind of crying. She was just ugly crying. And then we just stood there and held her. And then she talked about the grief that she was carrying, and we listened. And then she sat down, and she kind of calmed down, started breathing a little more. And then we prayed with her. And then she was like, okay, I'm ready to have lunch, because nothing is better after a good cry than lunch, right? We need to eat after those moments. Social media and podcasts have never once done that for a person, right? So this is what I've discovered as I've been on a listening tour, so to speak, of my community. And this is what is forming and informing the way in which my new church start is coming together as a community. We're on this journey of listening to the new thing that God is doing. And the new thing I think God is doing in my community is to speak into this loneliness and isolation and say there is a better way, and it is community. Notice the next part of this scripture says, I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Loneliness and isolation is a desert place, is it not? Amen. And God in my community, I think, is bringing water of life into the desperate loneliness and isolation and calling our church community to be a part of that work. God's already doing it, right? God's already doing it. My community's job is to listen and to look around and to have the eyes to perceive it and join with it, and to know that when we do that, we are doing life-giving work for our community because it's God's work, and we're joining with it. And God already sees the hurt of the people in my community. God's heart is breaking it more than mine is about those stories of people holding on to grief and having nowhere to go with it. Of that child with deep anxiety because she doesn't think she's good enough. Right? I just want to take her and look at her and say, you are loved by the creator of the universe. You are beautiful and made in the image of God. And you are loved. Right? We have a word to speak. And it is a life-giving word. And it is the word that God is already speaking. We just get to join with the proclamation of it. Right? That's beautiful work. So there's this other passage. It's actually one I love so much. As we're talking about our purpose in the world and listening to what God is doing and joining with that work, this comes from the prophet Jeremiah. And it's spoken while the people are still in exile. They are living in Babylon amongst the people they would call their enemies. And they keep crying out to God, God, to set us free, send us home. We want to go back to Israel. And God says, someday you'll go back, I promise you that. But in the meantime, here's the word of purpose I speak to you. As a community, again, not to individuals, but as a community. This comes from the 29th chapter. Somehow my first numbers are gone, but from the 29th chapter of Jeremiah. These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Wants to make sure we know they're exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon, right? So repeat it a number of times. Build houses and live in them. Okay, now remember, this is speaking to the exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon. These are the people who want to go build their houses back in Israel. They're in Babylon and they want to go home. And the word God speaks to them is build houses in your neighborhood. Build houses in this Babylonian neighborhood with these Babylonians who you consider your enemies. Build houses and live in them. You're not going to rent them out to those Babylonians. You're going to live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Ruth's children's message reminds us that when you plant a garden, you don't overnight harvest something. A garden is an act of hope, is it not? That you will be there to harvest when it grows, that you will be deeply rooted in this place enough to see it come to fruition. Gardens are acts of hope. Plant gardens. You're not going anywhere for a while. Next harvest season, you'll still be here, right? And eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. That's the second generation, right? God's saying to them, I will send you home to Israel at some point, but in the meantime, you're going to build houses, live here, plant gardens, eat the food, and you'll be here at least 2 generations. Give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. In its welfare you will find its welfare. As a church planter, I wish I was going out into the world and people were just longing to come to church. I wish instead of hearing people say, I listen to podcasts, or I thought I was going to raise my kid in church and we're fine without it, I wish people were saying, you're opening a new church? Sign me up. I want to be your chair of trustees. No one has ever once said that to me. No one ever will either. I can already tell. Right? I could long for a different community and a different neighborhood. Or I could get about the business that God is doing in the community I'm in and know that God is doing a new thing and that there are rivers coming in this desert place and that my welfare and my family's welfare and the welfare of the community I am building as a church community is tied up in the welfare of those people who are saying to me, I don't even think once about church. So I could waste my time longing for a different cultural landscape, or I can trust that God has good work to do in this neighborhood. And I can plant gardens and build houses. I only say that somewhat jokingly. The First Olympia Church is actually building tiny houses right now, right? They're actually building houses. They're not, well, people in the community might live in them. I mean, people in the Olympia community will. And I can trust that the work that God is doing amongst the neighborhood where I live is good work. And so when I ask myself questions about the purpose of me and my community, my church community, I have to keep coming back time and time again to who is my neighborhood and what work is God already doing there. What's breaking God's heart about the circumstance in this community, and in what ways is God bringing the water of life in the desert of this space? And how am I called to join with it? And I've told you a little bit about my community, but the truth is, I can't answer these questions for you. I could come and I could tell you, I'm going to tell you some stories of churches doing this kind of work. None of them are suggestions of what you should do. Because what is needed in one community and the work God is doing in one location is not the same as what God is doing in another. The truth is, we have some common core values that we share as followers of Jesus. Love God, love your neighbor, and love your enemy. Right? Those are non-negotiables. If you perceive God is up to some work that doesn't fit in those 3 things, probably not coming from God. But if it's about loving God, loving your neighbor, and loving your enemy as yourself, then the sky is the limit of the work that God might be doing. And even a church that might be 5 blocks away may have a different call in the community than this church has. And where you end up as your location might impact the call that God puts on you. But it's exciting and life-giving work. So I want to tell you a couple of stories from some other churches that are doing this kind of good work of knowing that their welfare is tied in with the welfare of the community around them. There's a church down in Oregon. It was a really tiny church. They were actually moving towards closing. And there was, I think it was their UMW. There was just a few women left. They were elderly. They didn't have much energy. And they were like, well, if this church closes, it closes. But on the way out, we want to do God's work, right? We want to listen to our community and see where God might be moving. And we're going to do that work until we shut the doors of this church. But they said, we're elderly. We don't have a lot of energy. We don't think we can work with little kids. It wasn't their call. So they looked around at their small community, and they actually looked at the high school, and they said, who doesn't get support at the high school? And what they realized was the girls' volleyball team never had anyone in the stands cheering for them. And so these women said, well, we can do that. We can go cheer for the girls' volleyball team. It's not going to take a whole bunch of energy, right? They only have a few games, right? We don't have to work with little kids. We can't run after them anymore. We can go cheer for the girls' volleyball team. So they started showing up at the high school girls' volleyball games and cheering for the girls. Well, guess what happened? They started to get to know the girls and their families. And the girls said, we would really like to have a team dinner. Can we do it at your church? And the women said, yes, we have this building. Please come have your team dinner here. And we'll even do some cooking for it because we love to cook. So they started hosting the girls' volleyball team dinners at the church. Well, then the girls said, there's other teams that don't get a lot of support. Like, would you come to the girls' basketball teams or games? And they said, yeah, we could do that too. Volleyball season's over. We might as well do that. Well, then they started hosting more team dinners. And guess what? The girls and their families said, well, we should maybe show up and support them on Sunday mornings. Not all of the girls. I'm not going to tell you a story of a church that went from 5 people to 500 because they did this. But the girls and their families started coming to church. Some of them, sometimes. And the church began to have life. And the community had life. And the girls, instead of playing to an empty gym, had people there who knew their names and were cheering for them and said, we would love to host a dinner for you. And so that church became interwoven with the community around it. And its welfare was tied up in the welfare of those girls and that high school and the families who were living there. God was doing a new thing, and they joined with it, and it brought life to the girls' teams at that high school and to that church community. We had a thriving clothing bank. We did ministry with the poor in our community. It all started because some women in the church realized that there was no place to even purchase clothing in that community. So very different. I actually stopped by your Fred Meyer on my way here, right? You can go to Fred Meyer, you can buy clothes. There's probably lots of places around here to buy clothes. But in Rochester, the closest place to purchase clothes, you have to go about 10 miles down the freeway to a Walmart. And then if you want to have other options, you have to head up north to Olympia, which is even farther away. And people who are in poverty have limited money. And if you spend your money driving, you don't have money left to buy clothes. And I don't know, one of the characteristics of poverty that we uncovered in that community was that people in poverty aren't buying, they can't afford fuel-efficient cars, right? So they're driving cars that get like 8 miles to a gallon. So by the time you go 10 miles down the road and 10 miles back, well, you're out like $10, right? Which would have been enough maybe to buy some clothes. So they started a clothing bank. It started small and it just kept growing and growing because it knew, that clothing bank knew the community and what their needs were. Right? The ladies at the church didn't say, I have a passion for clothing. They said, our community needs clothing. And what happened through that clothing bank is that it actually became a place not just of clothing, but a spiritual relationship. Lots of the people who came to the clothing bank would call the church our church, even though they never came on a Sunday morning. They would come in and they would bring their prayer requests, and we would hold their hands and we would pray for them. And they could cry, and they could come with their celebrations. If they went through like a cancer treatment and they got a good prognosis, they would come into the clothing bank and be like, I can't wait to tell you, I just got this diagnosis or this, these test results, and I'm cancer are free. And the whole clothing bank would erupt in celebration. It was not simply about giving out clothes. It was about forming community. But it was done in a way that said, what does our community need? What is God doing here? And how can we join with it? I was actually thinking when Ruth talked about Cheryl and her grandkids, how the Olympia First Church has joined in the work that God is doing in that family's life. I had the opportunity to go on a mission trip with them, Idaho Mission Project over to Idaho, and Cheryl's grandkids were a part of that community. There were a diversity of kids on that trip. Almost every clique of kids at a high school that you can imagine. We had the jock, we had the theater person, we had the, I'd rather be reading a book than be with you. We had the super outgoing, very popular. We had the band kids. We had, it was one of the most diverse groups. We had a student who had come from her second house, her vacation home, to that trip. We had somebody who was couch surfing and homeless, right? So in almost every way, there was diversity in that group. I've never seen a group of people love each other like that group of kids did. They were so kind to each other. They were so encouraging and supportive of each other. So much so, we were at Twinlow Camp, and there were other camps there. We kept, as the adult leaders, we kept getting comments about the kids and the ways in which they loved and embraced each other. Cheryl's grandkids were a huge part of making that happen. Right? As that church, as Olympia First, responded to these people that God brought in their door. God is doing a new thing through that church community, but through those kids too. So that the whole camp witnessed this, right? I actually came home from that trip, and I was so deeply moved by what I had witnessed. Because we live in a very divided culture, don't we? Right? We're around people who look like us, who think like us, who vote like us, right? And here were these kids who were so diverse, and yet could love each other and be kind to each other, so much so that they were a witness to other people. And it took me a couple weeks after coming home to really name what those kids had done for me, and they gave me hope. That's what I realized. Being around those kids gave me hope that we really can actually love each other and show kindness to each other in spite of our differences, that we can be a witness to the gospel of loving our neighbor and loving our enemy alike. But when I really, especially hearing Pastor Ruth talk, when I really realized where that started, it started with Olympia First, seeing what God was doing and joining with it to bring rivers into the desert place of this family's life, so that those kids were loved and nurtured and cared for and fed, and that family could hang on because they had a church community supporting them. Maybe not enough, but I can't imagine what that family would look like without that church there. And how that then was planting seeds that are growing. They planted seeds of hope in me that are going to continue to grow in my life. And they planted seeds in the lives of the people who witnessed their kindness at camp that will continue to grow. Because a church asks the question, what's going on in our community? What work is God doing? And how do we join with it? And so I don't know what the next chapter is for Trinity United Methodist Church. That's not my job to answer. Right? That's your job. Who is your community and what stories are they telling? What stories is God whispering over you about building homes and planting gardens and knowing that you might be here for the next generation and the generation after that, for building relationships, right? I mean, we may not like the language in that passage about have your sons take wives. I understand all of that, right? We have to read it knowing where they were in history compared to where we were. But what is that actually saying? Build relationships, isn't it? So maybe we're not going to go, claim wives for our sons. But what would it mean to get to know our neighbor and develop a lasting relationship that we are committed to? What if we looked at our neighbor and said, I'm committed to your well-being? Not just for a week or 2 weeks, but for 6 months and a year and 5 years and a generation after that. What kind of impact would that have on this neighborhood or wherever you end up planted? What impact would that have on your community? Right? That's the kind of water that God is bringing up in the desert places. I want to read just a little bit more into Jeremiah, and then I'll finish up. Those words I read, where God calls the people to embed themselves in their community, is in chapter 29, or maybe chapter 28. I somehow missed my verse numbers on my manuscript. But these are the words that come later in this chapter. They will be familiar to you. God says to the people, "For surely I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans for your welfare and not for harm, to give you a future with hope. Then when you call upon me and come and pray to me, I will hear you." My son just graduated from high school. He got lots of cards that have this verse on them, right? Like, familiar to us, right? It's often quoted, especially around graduation time. But again, it's, I think, misquoted because it's quoted in an individualistic way. God has plans for me, and they're good plans. I do believe that. I've experienced a call to ministry, and that was a call that came to me. But what I also recognize is even something like a call to ministry, which was my call, was always about community, right? I wasn't called to go preach at home alone in my living room. Although my kids would probably be happy with that because they wouldn't have to hear their mom preach all the time. But even that call was really a call into community. And when we misquote this, "I have plans for you, says the Lord, and they are good plans," and we think it's all about us, we're mistaking these verses, cutting them out, these verses that came before, where God actually says, in your neighborhood, in your community, with the people you might even call enemy, plant your gardens, build relationships. Their welfare and your welfare are intertwined. There's no separating them, right? These are the good plans that God has for us. Not for harm, but to give us and our communities a future with hope. And so, my prayers will be with you on this journey of discerning what God is doing amongst you here and now, in this time and place, in your neighborhoods, with your neighbors, maybe even with your enemies, right? Knowing that these are good plans that God has. Plans to bring water into desert spaces. Work that God is already doing, we just join with it. And it is what gives us and our communities a future of hope. Amen. Amen.
Now comes our time.